Hello everyone and welcome. I think this is the first webinar this year for the NRCOP. So thanks for making yourselves available and for your interest. We have got a really interesting conversation today around compliance planning, one of those areas that is often talked about but very difficult to do. My name is Adam Beaumont. I'm going to support the facilitation for today. But first I want to start by acknowledging traditional owners and First Peoples. For those that are listening and respect their elders past, present and future. We are running our Zoom platform this time in contrast to our Teams platform of last year. So that means we're not using the Slido function for questions. So for those that are keen to contribute, and we encourage you to contribute, you can use the Q&A element of this. So down the bottom, you've got a little Q&A button you can click. Feel free to just type your questions in. My eyeline will shift my second screen when I see them. And as best I can, I will work them into the conversation. So please chuck your questions down, upvote them if you want to. You can click the little like button and we'll do our best to integrate all the questions that we can. So how are we going to have this conversation? The conversation we're going to have is around compliance planning. How do you allocate scarce regulatory resources to things you care about? We're going to have that conversation literally as a discussion with our panelists, who I'll introduce shortly. But this is a big topic, and any expectation that we're going to cover it in totality is somewhat misguided. So to manage expectations, we want to talk a little bit first about, well, what are we actually talking about with compliance planning? And to support that conversation, we've got a mind map, which we're going to bring up on the screen now. Now, when you see it, don't feel like you suddenly have to absorb it all and read the detail. The purpose of this is simply to show the diversity of the potential topics and discussions that we could have around compliance planning. It will be available on ANZSOG's website after the session. The session will also be recorded. So if you don't get through all of it, or equally you want to recommend it to others, it will be up on ANZSOG's YouTube channel, generally within a couple of weeks. But this mind map will be available online, so don't feel like you need to zoom into the detail. But I'm going to talk about it really briefly to help frame our conversation. So compliance planning is literally the idea of saying, well, what do we care about? What are our priorities? And where are we going to put our compliance effort? So determining your compliance priorities. Now, in doing that, there's a strong linkage to, well, what do you care about? What are the harms of concern? What are the regulatory outcomes that you're trying to achieve? Equally, what's the state of harm? Do we know about this? Have we got enough data to say that this thing is causing more damage, hurting people, hurting markets, damaging the environment more than something else? It's determining where you're going to put your regulatory effort. Often beyond that, then you develop compliance plans that say, okay, well, we're going to do X amount of activity here or Y amount of activity here. You know, this is often something you need to understand your capacity. How much capacity have you got to chase things down? Where are your resources? How are they distributed? Where do you put your energy to minimize harm? And then there's this whole branch around communicating your plan. How do you forecast to duty holders about where you're going to go? Not so you can catch them out, but so they can get ready before you turn up, so that they actually do the thing you want them to do in advance. You know, the idea of maximizing voluntary compliance. Hey, we're going to check this thing. You can be prepared by doing X, Y, and Z. There's a whole piece around communication and engagement that sits around this. Equally, there's a whole discussion around risk profiling and risk assessment tools, and saying, well, where is the harm across your duty holder cohort? How do you profile people to know whether they're more likely to not comply than another area? How do you allocate effort between proactive and responsive activity? How to use data and intelligence systems? This is a big topic. We're not going to get through it all, but we really want to dig into, why would you do this? How would you do it? What are some of the challenges in doing it? And towards the end of the conversation, what do you wish you knew at the start, now that you're in the end of the process or putting this thing in place? So that is the broad topic. We won't get to all of it, but we'll do our best to cover some key bits to just whet your palate, or for those that are already doing it, perhaps get a greater insight into what's going on. So to help us with that conversation, I'd like to introduce our panelists. And we have a great panel. First, Andrew Wilson. He is the current General Manager of Compliance and Enforcement and Technical Services at Dairy Food Safety Victoria. Now, for those that don't know who Dairy Food Safety is, basically they license and run compliance activity around food safety across the Victorian dairy sector. Andrew has the joy of looking after all of the operational regulatory activity that Dairy Food do. He's had lots of roles around safe food production in Queensland. He's regulated primary production and food processing across lots of different commodity sectors. But during this time, he's kind of built up quite an interest in understanding methodologies that influence human behaviour and compliance culture within businesses to drive regulatory outcomes. He's got a background in ag science and molecular microbiology. So look, he is really well placed to help us understand, well, in a food safety setting, how do you determine where you're going to go? What's important? What do you check? So thanks, Andrew. We've also got Nick Hayes. He's the director at the ACCC. For those that don't know the ACCC, consumer protection is a big part of what they do. He's had a lot of different roles in the ACCC over the past 15 years around competition and consumer protection enforcement. Nick is actually responsible for ACCC's compliance and enforcement priorities, and he actually runs the team that does the strategic enforcement, coordination activity. He is the person that helps set the direction where the ACCC put their energy and effort. So he's got extensive experience in running enforcement programs and leading engagement, including with the Australian consumer law regulators. His team actually runs, well, he's run a couple of different teams, the international unit, the law reform and policy unit, and the consumer compliance team. So Nick is really well placed. He's been doing this for a long time to talk about where do you put your energies and effort. So thanks, Nick. Then we've got Rach Scalogna. Rach is a director at the Department of Regional Development, Manufacturing and Water in Queensland. She leads the strategic compliance team that sort of support delivery of sustainable management and regulation of water. So Rach is doing this for a living. She's got a long background. She spent 14 years in environmental regulation in prosecutions, compliance support, intelligence, training, regional delivery and policy. She is incredibly well placed to have a conversation around this. And she's also a member of the Queensland chapter of the National Regulators Community of Practice. She's pretty passionate about regulation and regulatory practice. So she is an asset to this conversation. Welcome, Rach. So thank you. This is your panel. We're going to run through a series of questions and conversations. Again, invite you to use the Q&A function. If you've got areas you want to dig into, if you've got questions that you want answered, if you've got comments around some of what you're hearing your panelists say, pop them in the box. We'll do our best to pick them up and keep the conversation going. So compliance planning, why would you do this? Why would you invest your energies in this? Nick, you've been doing this for a long time, like 11 or so years. Like what drove the need to do this? Why do it? Why do compliance planning?
Thanks, Adam. I think there's certainly a number of reasons why we quite publicly went out with our compliance and enforcement priorities and planning process almost 10 years ago to the day.
Happy anniversary.
Definitely. And I think it coincided with a few things in our organisation. There was a significant law reform the previous year that we needed to deal with. But I think it was really about being proactive and strategic as an organisation, not reacting to issues that we saw in the market. We still do that, but it was more about allocating our resources to be proactive and strategic in identifying the important problems. Malcolm Sparrow language in some ways, identifying the important problems, fixing the important problems and telling people about it. And that was really, the impetus for us in setting up our compliance and enforcement priorities and having an annual strategic review process as part of setting our priorities. So I think it's not just announcing the priorities, it's also the check-in and engagement with key stakeholders to identify new priorities, but also to talk about how we've gone in meeting our priorities and what outcomes we've achieved. So that was really our intent.
So that driver to be proactive, to stop being responsive, like, was there other pressures that came to just tell us where you're going or help us understand why?
Look, I think, one of the issues, we had a brand new law in Australia, the Australian Consumer Law, which commenced, 12 months prior to us announcing it. And we wanted to be more coordinated as an organisation and work closely with the Australian consumer law regulators in how we actually implemented and enforced the new Australian consumer law. We're a large organisation. We have lots of fiefdoms across the country, a Darwin office, a Perth office, a Townsville office, and we really needed to make sure that we're operating as a national organisation as well. And I think that was another key driver for us is, everyone moving in the same direction as an organisation.
Yeah. Rach, I'm curious to bring you in on this one. Like, what drove yours? Like, Nick's told a story about trying to get alignment, trying to put your energy and effort, trying to help coordinate. Like, what was the driver for you guys? Why compliance planning? Why do it?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. It's similar to Nick. I think it's making sure you're all moving in the same direction. Culturally, I've seen it as to be a really important tool as well to put compliance on the agenda. I guess the premise of a plan is that you're thinking about it, you're deliberate, and you're committing those resources and that time and energy to deliver something. And in that preparation of the plan as well, it's being clear around what we want to achieve. And so you get to think about where you're at as an organisation when you're developing your plan. So one of the drivers is to try and figure out where we're at and where we want to go and how do we get there.
So Rach, then in terms of that drive again to get everyone centered, focused on similar things, like invariably there's some challenges around that. Presumably, people sometimes don't like being told what to chase after. I know my patch, I know the area. Like, was there a challenge in trying to get people to come together and talk about what you want to focus on?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's the reality because everyone, especially in the environmental space, and Nick and Andrew probably have the same in their fields as well, everyone, given their experience and their knowledge and where they sit across the state, have different interests and drivers to what makes them do what they do and what they see as important. So there's a challenge in bringing all those brains together to think that through. But I think that's one of the benefits of compliance planning is it allows you to challenge each other and think through and then work out where you may want to focus now and where you may want to focus into the future and what do you need to get there, whether it be data, black holes, or just the capability of the workforce. It's all good having a great plan, but if you can't then deliver it because you may not have the infrastructure or the skill sets just yet, that planning process can help you also ensure that you put those steps in place to deliver what you're hoping to deliver.
Now, Andrew, I want to bring you in here because I've never met a regulator yet who says, oh, yeah, I've got enough resources. Like sometimes they might have the resources, but they're poorly distributed. Now, in contrast to Rach's team and the ACCC where Nick is, like dairy food safety is not that big. Like, did that change the driver for compliance planning for you?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I guess really for us, yes, we are faced with the perennial problem that many regulators face, a large number of licensed entities and a small number of resources to dip into to verify compliance. We have just under 3,500 dairy businesses that we license or regulate in Victoria. And I have 6 full-time verification staff that look after those. DFSV is lucky enough to be part of a national food regulatory system that's always been risk-based on a broad perspective. So we've always had this approach where activities are given a nationally agreed risk rating, high, medium or low, and then regulatory effort is focused on those, mainly, where we have high risk, regulators tend to focus that on because that's where consumers tend to be most vulnerable. In addition to that, to augment that approach, I mean, we looked at this a little bit further than that to say, okay, well, this is normally done on a time-bound basis. So high risk activities get checked a certain number of times per year or per license period ad nauseum. But in looking at that approach, I guess for us, we realised that we're still effective in doing that, but there are probably some better efficiencies we can add to that to really get sharper and better support verification activities. And for us, it's actually looking at a system where we have a very slow rate of change in the industry. So people have been taking milk from cows for eons, and the basic way of doing that hasn't changed. Therefore, the risk associated with that on a large scale hasn't really changed. But the challenge then for us becomes is how do you improve on a regulatory system that doesn't involve a lot of fast pivots? And for us, that was looking at, I guess, how can we focus our energies to better allocate resources even within businesses themselves or within licensed businesses, as opposed to just the broad brush, high risk, low risk, medium risk approach.
There's an invariable challenge there, though, isn't there? Like, firstly, you've got to have the data to know whether someone is high risk or low risk, but also you've got to, there's an entropy or a sort of a stickiness around what people do. Oh, we've always done it that way. We always check such and such 3 times a year. Like, how did you convince people to go, no, let's come up with a plan, an approach? Like, how did you sell that?
I guess for us, it's always a journey with these changes. Traditional audit, at least from my personal perspective, is something that's sort of well practiced. But when we have people that are checking compliance more broadly, verifying any compliance in any sector using a sort of a rote checklist approach, there's the systems tend to be checked in a very standard format. Yet we still seem to have problems with compliance. On paper, we have businesses that are well compliant, that tick all the boxes, but when the chips are down, they often fall over. And we sort of looked at that more broadly and went, okay, well, what other things can we look at here? Where are the gaps? And when we started to reframe that conversation to say, well, let's look at it from a systematic approach. Let's look across those elements to see how they change. There's a that approach certainly makes people want to hold on to, well, what about the checklist? I really want to hang on to those things because I know and love those things. They set a framework for me. But being able to say, well, yes, we're covering off on those checklists just in a different way is certainly a challenge, and one that needs to be clearly communicated through staff. So we went through a process of I guess, organisational change management to look at that and show people that, internally and externally, that what we were actually checking was all the same. It was just the methodology by which we were checking it changed.
Nick, can I bring you on this one? Because that whole piece of engaging and working with your teams to pick the priorities and then where you look, sometimes within those priorities, like you've been doing this for a long time, like 10 years is quite a perspective to have. How did you actually set those priorities? How did you engage people, internally and externally, to go, yeah, we're going to run down this, this, and this?
I think we've learned a lot over the last 10 years as to how we run that process. Now, what we do is we have a range of surveys that we look to engage with people. So it's a free-for-all, internal and external, for people to complete a survey and put forward ideas and suggestions. We do a lot of data analysis of what we have. We talk with other regulators in the space. But where I think we get a lot more value is, fairly detailed one-on-one discussions about where the market is heading, what are the problems in the market, what are the issues you're seeing with our external stakeholders and some of our key internal stakeholders, but sitting down with some of the key business and consumer groups that we deal with on a regular basis for, an hour and a half, 2 hours, and actually talking, and gathering a lot of data and having a conversation, which really does, feed into our priorities. We also talk with the international regulators as well as the state regulators in the consumer space as well. Can be a bit painful, having a conversation with European colleagues, that goes on till after midnight. 2 hours into it is a lot. But it's actually an enjoyable process, and we've really gotten a lot of value out of it, not just on identifying what the priorities are, but helping us identify a plan forward as well. For a lot of the work that we will do, it will involve collaboration with international regulators. If we're looking at digital platforms or sustainability and environmental issues, we will leverage and work with domestic and international regulators to actually achieve that. So I think that's a key part of what we do.
I'm curious on this one because I had an old boss who used to talk a lot about the priorities look different when you're outside the building. If you're inside the building looking out, the priorities look different if you're outside the building. Like, how did you find the difference between talking to your own internal teams about, we think these are the priorities, and then going out to industry or business or stakeholders or other community? Like, how often did these things overlap?
Look, I mean, I think where we're at the moment is about 90% of the priorities that we're considering for this year, and which we'll announce next week, there was alignment internally with staff, internally with senior commissioners, with external stakeholders. So what we had identified, internally within our organisation aligned with what our external stakeholders were saying, which is a really high percentage compared to previous years. Generally there's fairly good alignment, but this year it really was, something that came through in all of the data and all of the conversations we had, that, this is what we as an organisation needed to focus on. So I think in part that gives us a sense of confidence that, we've got the process working reasonably well. We're sense checking our views internally with what people externally are saying as well.
It's interesting, that question of confidence. Rach, I know in some of our talks in the lead up to this conversation, you talked a lot about data black holes and having confidence in, risk frameworks and being actually stick data in there to channel it. There's quite a few questions that have come in on the Q&A around that notion of intelligence and sourcing it, and how do you actually assess the risk and get the data to do it? Can you talk about some of the challenges you had in actually getting the feedstock to form a view about where the harm is and therefore where you go?
Yeah, no worries. I think data is the key. Like, what are you inputting in to help you understand what then you need to do about it? For us, it was trying to look at, how do we know that? How do we know something might be a risk or not a risk? And what are some of the things that we need to either collect to help us do that? Or is there a stepping stone here that we should be putting some effort into? So an example might be in regulating water, you're allowed to use a certain amount, for example. And you submit a read, like a meter read annually, to tell you how much you're using. And what we found is that we weren't getting necessarily a high rate of return on those meter reads, and that was causing a lot of issues in terms of resourcing and having that, demonstrated understanding. So being able to have the numbers to say, well, how much use is there across the state? And that was the key information we needed to know to work out what we were doing reduce the risk of overuse, for example. So we put a lot of effort in building the understanding, building the effort and the efficiencies around getting those reads in, to then make a decision a few years down the track about what our risks may be in that space.
And how did you manage that current to future need? Like, so you've got data about, we've got a gap here, we're predicting in the next short term this is the issue. How did you look beyond that and go, well, actually, this could be another issue, like in terms of that horizon scanning or concept of that?
We just got to ask the question around the outcome. So how much use is there? And then we worked backwards to work out, well, maybe we couldn't answer all of that. And in some areas, a lot of local knowledge would know, but could we put it in an executive way or a way to demonstrate? And I think that Andrew picked up on some of that in terms of how you use the data and the results of what you do to demonstrate there's value in doing this activity to achieve this outcome. And there's lots of data sources departments hold, but people might not necessarily see the value in using it in compliance. It has its value in other activities for sure, but it's trying to understand that data and then think about whether it's useful for you to input it into your compliance, or can it help part of that conversation to help understand your risks. So I think some of it's patience and time, and trying to understand the business and use the people that are doing the work to help along that journey. That's my greatest advice to those that are regulating. Do it collectively. Don't do it in isolation.
Andrew, do you want to talk about that? Like, in terms of that point of, you can be overwhelmed with data, or that's useful, that's not. Like, sometimes it might be hard to know what's useful. Like, how have you detangled what's important versus what's not?
I think it's a great point Rachel brings up when she says, like, you've got to look at what you've already got in your toolkit. There's heaps of information that we sit on as regulators, and even, the people we license for the same situation, that they don't look at with a fresh set of eyes. We've always done it this way. Therefore, we evaluate the situation using these standard metrics. But if you chuck it all into a single bucket and then look at, trying to pull out some insights from that, then that can be really valuable in, certainly guiding proactive activities, both from your own perspective as a regulator, but also providing that information externally to those that you regulate. For ourselves, we've done a little bit of exploration into that. We've looked at all of the licensing information, all the compliance and information that we had against some of our dairy manufacturers for the past sort of 10 years, and we threw it all into a big bucket and looked at some an artificial intelligence tools and machine learning to see whether or not it could pull out any identified patterns when we told that program what the risks were around, particular food safety recalls. So, for example, if we had multiple listeria detections in a given product combined with poor compliance outcomes, then was that a precursor to that company having, more recalls or other issues within the marketplace? And we did a real quick and dirty proof of concept on that, and the results are really promising. So we're looking at how we can now better structure data in our business to look at our regulated cohort and give us those insights in a more succinct way. We were sort of getting, when we did it rough, we were kind of getting sort of 85% correlation, something like that, which is not great from a purely mathematical point of view, but the trends were there. So the simple message was for us is if we can structure our data right, and we are going through a process of moving to a new licensing and compliance management system at the moment, then we can apply that tool over the top of that data to give us better insights that we can then share with our regulated entities. In that way, we actually, sorry, mate, go on.
Well, in that instance, it's because it makes sense. Have you brought that, you're only a small organization. Have you brought that resource in? Have you, do you outsource? How would someone listening go, oh, I like what Andrew's talking about. How do you practically do that? Are you recruiting someone with that expertise? Are you, people you can farm that stuff out to? Or
at the moment, we're partnering with just a small machine learning AI company to do that. So basically, we brought them in on as I said, a proof of concept basis, because this is a more strategic planned strategic activity under our broader RegTech initiative that we're running at DFSV, and that's really about getting businesses to supply information more readily to us that we can both share and adequately respond. So it works for us on two levels. One, it gives us intelligence about the business themselves, but also it allows businesses to see the same information in the way that we view it and take proactive action and in a way driving self-regulation, if you like. I have to probably caveat that comment to say that obviously to bring people onto that journey, engagement is king. You can't engage enough on that. You got to go through a co-design process with industry. You need to manage expectations with your cohorts to say, this is what's going to happen when we see this, and then stick to that plan.
Nick, can I bring you in on this one? Because it's, Andrew, in your example, you've got a depth of data about your particular area. Nick, for you, where you've got consumer protection, which is incredibly broad, you may not have that same depth of data in any one area. How have you done this? How have you used Intel to form, a judgment about where to put effort?
I suppose we haven't really used Intel to make that decision as to whether we focus on a particular area. I mean, it's one of the tools that complements our focus. I saw one of the Q&A questions here was talking about horizon scanning, looking at some of those priorities, and that's one thing that we do try and do, is actually look at what's next over the horizon and work out what we need to do as a regulator to focus on emerging priorities or issues that might be something that will cause us concern in a couple of years. And I think it's how you treat it as a compliance problem. And that's, you don't have the same enforcement approach. You don't have the same, inspectorate work that you might be doing. There are different compliance tools that you can use to try and determine, how significant is an emerging issue, engagement with the sector to work out where there are particular problems, how you can change that behaviour if you think it's heading down a direction that you don't want, where there will be, competitive or consumer protection issues, publishing, research reports, position statements, using those different tools, has enabled us, to get ahead, or at least have a discussion about an emerging issue in the market. I think an example for us is we did have some concerns about customer loyalty schemes, and it was a priority for the ACCC. And all we really did was we published a report. It changed some behaviour in the market, but it also gave us a sense that what we thought was a potential competition and consumer issue in the market wasn't really a significant concern for us as an organisation. So I think that's a key approach that we're trying to take is compliance, and achieving compliance. We have to use a multitude of different tools and approaches to actually address it. And that's what we're trying to build into our compliance and enforcement planning much more now than we did when we started.
Yeah, and it's a good point because, in terms of these general duty type provisions, a whole sector of protecting consumers versus, Andrew, your point where you've got a registered or a permitted or an authorized or a licensed cohort, I imagine that's slightly different. Rach, in your example, where you license people or permit people to undertake certain activity, in theory, you might have more data on them or not, as the case may be, about what they're doing. How does that change? How does it change the tactics you've used over the years of compliance planning based on having a known cohort of people versus an unknown cohort of people, similar to what, Nick described?
Yeah, I was thinking when both Nick and Andrew were talking, I think your regulated community or obligatees or whatever you want to call them, knowing what that looks like and who could cause damage or take more water than they needed to, or impact on a water course that then has ongoing effects, and understanding that first. Because yes, we have people that are licensed and have responsibilities on that, but there's also people that can operate without licenses and do activities that could cause more harm and may not be on our radar. So I think it's thinking about the data. So first of all, the group that you're regulating and thinking about what their motivations are, what their drivers are, the timing of the activities that they do. So if water is there or water it's not there, and think about how you might deal with that and what data you need for that. Versus, I've heard in some of the chats like environmental scanning and sort of really looking around where the risks are, where is the environment at, or the space that you're regulating, what are the impacts of that, and then trying to use some broader tools like satellite imagery and things like that to get a more broader landscape view. So I've seen in the veg world I was in, anyone can cut trees down in a rural setting, and so satellite imagery was a good tool to give us data to work out where that change may be happening, and then direct our effort there, which is different to saying, I regulate you and you have a license and a level of responsibility and I can communicate with you, I've got your email address, all that sort of stuff. So I think it's understanding your environment and using, like Nick said, the different tools to best address those and collect the data to be proactive.
Rach, can I ask a question on, so you go through this process of assessing risk, you build a plan and you go out there and you monitor or you surveil, or Nick, to your point, you push intelligence out to the market and see which way it moves or how people respond. How, in terms of having a compliance plan that you can report back, we care about these things, we've done this stuff and this is what's changed. Rach, can you talk a little bit about your experience of how compliance planning has helped you tell a performance story about what you do as the regulator?
It's really hard. If I could start at the outset, I think it's really hard to tell how effective you are or how you are performing. And I noticed a couple of questions there about that. I think it's starting with the why we do what we do. So why we're here to regulate. And obviously someone put some rules in place because they thought it was important. So therefore, if we were to do stuff, are we actually helping address the why and achieve the outcome in that space? But you've got to think also around timeliness and efficiencies as a regulator as well, and what might help you tell your story. So everyone says we want to be a best practice regulator, we want to be timely with our responses, but why? And some of that may help to collect the right data to tell the right story. And sometimes it's not data, right? You can't, you know, how many audits you do doesn't necessarily, it says you're out and about, but it doesn't necessarily say you achieved an outcome because of it. So is it, we did these audits in these high risk areas, and these are high risk areas because of X, Y, and Z, and we found this level of compliance, you know, as a good thing. So you're saying you're addressing the highest risks. That's just an example. I don't think there's a one-stop shop or like a textbook that can tell you exactly how to do this. And I think we've demonstrated that today. It's not easy, and it really does depend on your maturity as a regulator, the journey that you're on, and you've just got to try some things, I think. And, you know, sometimes they'll work and sometimes they won't. And where they work, tell that story and do something with it.
Now, Nick, you've had 10 years of trying things. How have you gone in terms of that feedback loop between we're going to do this and then reporting back on what you did?
I mean, one of the things that we do as part of it, setting our priorities in our strategic review, is actually discussing how we've gone against the priorities. You know, we have a regular cohort that we engage with as part of this process. It's not just about examining, you know, what are the new emerging priorities over the horizon. It's actually talking about how effective we've been under our current priorities as well. So we do ask that question in setting the priorities, you know, looking for feedback from, you know, different groups, internal and external, as to whether or not we've achieved our aims. Some programs are better, some, you know, lend themselves to having better data and better measurement tools to assess the effectiveness of our intervention. Others, it's quite amorphous and it's very difficult to, you know, work out whether or not, you know, you've changed, you know, behaviour right across, you know, the advertising and selling spectrum in Australian retail market. But, you know, we try and use as many metrics as we can to measure. And a good example is, you know, an increase in complaints data for us, you know, perhaps is indicative that there's greater awareness amongst consumers and businesses about a particular compliance obligation. So, you know, that alone doesn't mean that we've been unsuccessful in prioritising a particular form of conduct.
Yeah, and I know we talked prior to this panel discussion around, you know, projecting your compliance plan out there to encourage tip-offs and encourage complaints and use, you know, surrogate regulators to put more pressure on your duty holder base. Sorry, Nick, I cut you off. You keep going.
I was just going to say, I think one of the tools that we found really quite successful for us as a regulator is when we announce our priorities, there are a number of external law firms, industry associations and others that actually watch with interest what we announce, and then they will, you know, reach out to members of their association, or if they're law firms, to their clients, and actually advise that the ACCC has prioritised conduct X. You know, this is what you need to do to address it, and that really has been a really effective compliance mechanism for us. Is, you know, by announcing the priorities, you know, we do see that change, and, you know, we do see people coming into us saying, we saw that you announced this as a priority, this is what we have done, you know, in a proactive manner to address your concerns. So I think, you know, that for us is a measure of some success as well.
Andrew, can I throw that one to you? You know, it's not just the process of targeting your effort, but also telling people where you're going, and that's going to change behavior. Like, two-pronged question. The first one on, have you seen that in terms of telling people we're going to look at these areas? Do you see an uplift in performance? And equally, in terms of reporting back on your effectiveness as a regulator, how's it changed the tone or the conversation?
Probably address the you know, them in order of questions being asked. I think, and I noticed there's a comment in the Q&A about how to better connect and leverage some of those activities as part of your compliance planning. At DFSV, we're lucky enough to have a unit who looks after science, surveillance, and technical services. And we realise that, you know, if you haven't got the information and able to help you to help you gain, you know, or to help you better plan compliance, and you've got to go out and get it. So we run a process of whereby we focus, engage with through surveys with that team. That team is non-regulatory in nature. They go out and they collect information from our licensees about a particular risk, and that might be informed by, say, compliance patterns from the previous year. We've issued a lot of compliance actions around, for example, a particular risk. Well, then let's go out and do a survey about people that undertake that activity and tell the story about how well our industry controls that given risk or has implemented that. We then take that information and analyse it, present it back to industry with guidance to say, here's where we're at currently. Not that we're doing a bad job of this, but here's where we're at, but here's where we see improvements can be made, and here's the way to do that. But using then that information to support our compliance activities as well. So when my compliance staff go in to verify those controls, if they identify issues, they've got a ready-made resource to point the licensee towards and say, here's where you're not quite up to scratch. Here's this information to support compliance in a sustainable fashion going forward. So we shouldn't have to have this conversation when I come back again. And that uplifts the whole industry as a piece. And then also there's flow down effects from that as well. For we've seen things like, secondary effects, better quality, better process control, things like that the result, because people actually go, oh, actually, I thought I had a pretty good handle on that. Turns out I don't. So, and I think that being able to tell that story over and over again is really, really a way to demonstrate then to all stakeholders, governments, ministers, and otherwise, that you're actually adding value to your regulatory job. You're not just in there swinging a stick and banging people. You're actually saying, well, look, for your license fee, in our case anyway, you don't just get us rocking up twice a year to issue some tickets. You actually get a systematic review of what's happening. We come in there to verify your compliance, but also in addition to that, there's other functions of the organisation that support sustained compliance and it's in your interests to do so.
Rach, can I ask you a question on this? Like the concept of the bush telegraph, which is pretty prominent in a lot of regional communities. I heard so-and-so got checked for X, Y, and Z. Oh yeah, didn't you hear that they're checking blah, blah, blah? Police now targeting speeding, police now targeting seatbelts. Like, what's the value of a compliance plan and casting a message, a la what Andrew was talking about, to your duty holder base, saying, hey, just so you're aware, we're going to check such and such.
Yeah, the bush telegraph is alive and well in our organisation, and often a very positive thing. It may not be at the high end of town with the lawyers necessarily circulating things to make sure they're clients, but you're seeing that feedback loop. So, we might communicate and say, these are the things that we think we should be working on, and we're going to be putting some effort into it, but then that feedback loop to say, this is what we did about it. So an individual person who may have had an audit happen on their property, and then some tips provided to them or some correction that they needed to undertake, as well as then sending it to that area and say, hey, we said we were going to do some audits. We did them in these areas, and my regional colleagues are really good at using that at the meetings that they have with organisations, and using those associations with members to spread that information. Because it could be, we found these things, and like when you get your electricity bill, it tells you, you're a house of 4, you're kind of under or over where you need to be.
And Nick, you kind of talked about, the equivalent telegraph through law firms and, equivalent advisory bodies. Can you also control, or you look after not just the compliance planning area, but also, you've got other enforcement teams. There's a great question in here around how you leverage multiple activities, tactical and strategic, to cast a longer shadow or change the threat of detection, or, to Rachel's point, just let people know, hey, you better sort that out because so-and-so's coming. Like, how important is the compliance plan been in helping leverage effort across the regulator?
I think it's been central, and it's probably the biggest lesson we've learned in having this over the last 10 years is we talk about having an integrated compliance and enforcement approach. It's about identifying those problems, getting our call centre to be aware of what's important, using that to make decisions about what cases to pursue and why. And then when we actually pursue cases through the courts, the one change that we're trying to implement across our organisation is you don't stop once you get that penalty from the federal court. Leveraging that is really central to what we do. You know, the whole reason for actually taking a matter through the courts in the first place isn't really about penalising the business for non-compliance. It's trying to identify, you know, systemic, you know, market-based issues where we want change. So we are trying to do a lot more work at the back end, and that, you know, does involve a lot more engagement, a lot more education, a lot more compliance once we actually achieve that outcome. And we've got to get better as an organisation, you know, in communicating those outcomes and those results. And that's one of the things that we're learning through our process, is how to better communicate with people, you know, what we're doing and why we took enforcement action in the first place and what change we want to achieve. I think one of the things that frustrates me as an individual is getting, you know, for example, a $50 million penalty against a business, but then having more complaints and many of those issues arising again, you know, in the next, you know, 3 or 4 months after that court outcome. So I think, you know, that's the big push internally for us, is to really make sure it's integrated right up and down, from our, you know, call centre staff to our investigators to our compliance people and to our public relations people right across the organisation.
There's a question in the chat that's not dissimilar, where it talks about behaviours or practices of duty holders and trying to capture the entire regulatory population in, you know, both in the analysis but also in trying to move behaviour of a whole cohort of people. In your instance, you've got very big cohorts of people, some of which you may not even know or have limited data on their existence. How do you, you know, to help the person who's put this question up, how do you deal with big populations and trying to capture and access them and communicate what you're doing to them?
Look, in one sector, you know, there's, you know, 140 manufacturers that we would regulate, and we took action against one regulator, and the 139 knew that we weren't going to take any more enforcement action because, you know, we were tied up in the federal court. We want to avoid that situation in the future. So in some cases it is, you know, might be a federal court action. In other cases it might be administrative action. In other cases it's compliance engagement. So trying to make sure we have an appropriate balance in our intervention that does have, you know, an impact right across the sector and has a flow on, you know, benefit further down. And that means engaging with people, you know, to receive complaints and reports. And from our perspective, a lot of the valuable examples of non-compliance come from competitors in that industry rather than, you know, consumer complaints. And we've got to treat them with respect. And if we go after one business, we have to make sure that we have a plan, you know, to regulate the others in the market as well.
Yeah, the value of those tip-offs.
Yeah.
Rach, you know, your department is very broad, and I appreciate that you've got to focus on water, but you've also got a lot of experience within the department. There's a great question in here around, what do you do when the harm or the outcome you're after covers multiple regulators or multiple domains? You know, water, habitat, flora and fauna. Like, how do you manage this situation where the harm that you care about, you may not be the only regulator who are trying to run that harm down? Like, what do you do in that instance? Have you had that circumstance where you're going, yep, our compliance plan says we're going to run this down, and that involves 3 other regulators? What, if you have, what have you done?
Well, the Murray-Darling Basin comes to mind, as well as in regulating some of the veg stuff. You've obviously got, you know, veg sits in lots of different land parcels that could be owned and organised or controlled by another department. Similar to what Nick sort of outlined in the beginning, I think it's understanding that and knowing what your part in is, but engaging. So you can do lots of things like agreements with other agencies and do joint investigations, or, you know, share the problem and come up with some solutions that you can each do, and collectively that can help change or address a harm. It can be difficult because departments or people who are responsible have competing interests and priorities. And so sometimes I think it's demonstrating the problem, starting small and then building it as you go. And you can learn from your colleagues. They may be capturing information that you didn't realise could then help you figure out if an issue is something you need to. So, you know, being present, telling people what you do, what you're responsible for, and therefore how they may help you can help that conversation happen, and building those relationships at an officer level, I think has some great benefits. And that's just some ideas. Again, I don't think we're still growing in that space, as a lot of organisations are. But yeah, the environment is a shared responsibility with those that live and breathe in the environment, and also those that regulate aspects of it.
Andrew, you've got a similar bailiwick here. Like you're an entity that's replicated around the country. You know, you've got this national sort of regulatory framework as well. How do you manage that? Like, some of the problems that you have may not be unique to Victoria. They might be replicated in 4 other jurisdictions. How do you manage it?
Absolutely not. We deal with, as you say, a common activity that's carried out, you know, through in most states in Australia, and we have a number of mechanisms to deal with that. Like, obviously, we work with. We have I guess a national, I'll call it a national regulators forum for dairy, particularly. DFSV chairs that forum. We talk about basically all of the things that maybe, say, for example, emerging. We talk about things that may impact on compliance, or that may impact on standards, etc., on a national basis. And really, we have those conversations as early as possible with all of our regulators. And if they're important enough across the entire food regulatory system as well, there are still mechanisms in place to deal with that. Obviously, each state has its own jurisdiction and its own remit around implementation of those codes, but it's really good when we can gain alignment on how we do it, and we get pretty good agreement, generally speaking. And I think that's really an artifact of being, as mature in that space as we have been. We've had that system in place for more than 20 years now. And I think that then to keep having those conversations and talk to those bigger businesses, but not forgetting the smaller businesses. They all experience the same issues, the same pressures, the same regulatory approaches. Then I guess that it helps us as a national group to then front up to those challenges when they arise.
We could keep going. We're running to the clock now, but I think it's interesting just in this conversation, and going back to some of those elements at the start that we talked about. Like, there's a real merit in putting a peg in the ground and going, these are what we're going to run down. These are the priorities that we're after, both in consolidating energy and effort. Nick, to your point around coordinating activity that's nationally wide, encouraging people, tip-offs, complaints, encouraging a platform where you can then report and tell a story about what you've done and why. We talk about this for another 20 minutes, but I'm curious, you've been doing this, all of you, for a while. Nick, maybe I'll throw to you first. What do you wish you knew when you started this journey that you know now? What are the 1 or 2 things that, for those sitting in the audience, either in the thick of this at the moment or wanting to be a bit more structured and proactive, and like, what's the story? What would you tell them, the 1 or 2 things that you wish you knew that you can tell them?
I think from my perspective, there's 2 things. One is it's an internal and an external document, and making sure people internally understand the value of this as an external tool. And that's a challenge, and that's something that we continue to work on. And the other key point, and I've mentioned it a couple of times, is it's an integrated approach. We don't just want enforcement cases, education pieces, audits, and so on. It really needs to be integrated right across the organisation and then follow through. And I often sort of describe it as a circular process of, what you do on one end, leads around. So if you take enforcement action, that then leads to further engagement and vice versa. And I think, that's really what we're trying to stress internally on how we use our compliance and enforcement approach at the ACCC.
Seems eminently sensible. Rach, what are your nuggets? What are the one or two things you go, oh my God, if only I'd done blah, blah, blah.
Not so much if only if I'd done that, but maybe I had that in my head at the outset, is don't go from 0 to 100 or 0 to hero in 1 year or one cycle, because you'll probably just, trying to do too much at once. And I think use the process to get where you're at, and then think about where you want to go and make it an integral, ongoing improvement. And Nick's obviously, and Andrew have demonstrated that with the growth that their organisations and ours have had in taking it step by step. So yeah, don't try and do it all at once. And the other one is think about what outcome you want to achieve and make sure you can actually then demonstrate that. So make sure your plan includes how you're going to collect information or what you're going to do with it, so that you can sell the benefits and that integrated circular loop back in to keep driving you forward.
Yeah, otherwise it's just a shopping cart of hopes and dreams, yeah?
Yeah, it's just a work list, yeah.
Yeah. Andrew, how about you? What's your pearls of wisdom?
It's probably the hazard of going last, but Rachel kind of pinched one of mine, so I'll probably elaborate a little bit on her last point. And I think that really it's look at ways to evaluate effectiveness other than just straight measures of compliance. That's a really rough and really poor measure. 95 to 98% compliance is great, but when you're talking to people generally, but what does that really mean? There are other ways you can measure that compliance that aren't that obtuse, and actually demonstrate that you deliver value to all your stakeholders, rather than just being a regulatory burden to business or more broadly. And I think the other thing that I'd say is that, like consider how you would, in terms of compliance planning. For me, one of the other things is that one size does not always fit all. You need to really be, I guess, delicate in how you treat different areas of the organisation of your regulated cohort, keeping in mind their individual pressures and, to pick up on Rachel's point, your intended outcome. So what's necessarily great for one of the largest dairy manufacturing plants in the Southern Hemisphere may not necessarily be great for an artisanal cheesemaker with half a dozen goats. But how do we obtain the same outcome with that? I think that you need to look at the licensee cohort and understand the risks in context, and then nuance how you apply that. Then look at those markers for action in those contexts individually.
Then I think they're really great points. Look, thank you so much. I think there's a lot of people going, okay, yep, I reckon I can start this, or I reckon this is a place to start. I think the overwhelming message for me and what I've heard is that giving it a crack and actually putting a peg in the ground and say, well, this is what we think is important, and we'll do our best to run these things down, is the starting point for a whole lot of activity, both internal and external, that makes you a better regulator. This is generally, I think, one of the hardest area of regulatory practice. Everyone's talking about, oh, I've got to be a risk-based regulator. This is where that really hits the road and becomes something a bit more tangible. People will judge us on our choices. So thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you for people who've added in questions in the chat box. We've got about half of those. We'll do our best to have a look at them. And where we can, we'll get you some dot points around some of the questions we didn't get to. Thanks again to our panelists. This will be available on ANZSOG's YouTube page, I reckon, I don't know, in a couple of weeks, as will the mind map. We'll put that up there as well. For those who are interested in hearing some of the other webinars, we've got a few more coming up. They're on the screen now. Interesting conversation around agile regulatory governance from OECD. And what's great is we've actually got someone from the OECD who's going to talk to that, which I think will be fascinating. We've also got Kate Jenkins, who's the Sex Discrimination Commissioner, in a really difficult area of practice around OC health and safety in terms of sexual assault, abuse, threatening behaviour, neglect, bullying. So I think that will be a fantastic conversation. To everyone who's joined, I hope you get some value. Share it with others who you think might also value it. Until we see you again, thanks to the panelists, and have a lovely afternoon.